Hello and welcome to the Thyroid Pharmacist Healing Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Izabella Wentz. Today, I'm joined by somebody that I've been wanting to interview for many, many years. I've been a long time follower and learning so much from him. This is Elliot Overton joining us from France. He is, I consider the world's top expert on thiamine. And we're going to be diving deep into this one very interesting nutrient called thiamine. We're going to be talking about how it relates to thyroid fatigue, POTS, SIBO, and a lot of really different conditions. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into the various formulations and how to get the best results with thiamine. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about Elliot. He is a nutritionist based in France and the founder of EO Nutrition. His primary research area focuses on the clinical use of high dose thiamine, which is vitamin B1, for managing chronic disease. Elliot frequently lectures and speaks at educational events aimed at practitioners, helping to broaden the understanding and application of thiamine in clinical settings. He also runs the YouTube channel EO Nutrition, manages the website thiamineprotocols.com, and is the co founder and director of Objective Nutrients, a nutraceutical company specializing in excipient free thiamine derivatives and related supplements. Elliot, welcome. It's so great to have you here.
So great to be here. Thanks so much for having me on, Isabella. Long-term fan.
Oh my gosh, likewise. I think I first learned about your work after myself trying thiamine. When I was on my healing journey, I did a SpectraCell test and it showed that I had low levels of thiamine. And I was like, okay, this is really interesting. And I ended up finding a research study. It was actually like a case study, maybe three people who had a hypothyroidism and they were put on thiamine around 600 milligrams per day and their fatigue resolved. So I was like, this is a pretty safe nutrient. I had learned about it in pharmacy school for like alcoholism and people might be deficient when, in very like severe cases of it. And I was like, well, I'm not an alcoholic, but let's give it a try. Let's see what happens. And I took thiamine 600 milligrams within like 3 to 5 days. My fatigue completely turned around. My brain just really awakened. And interestingly, I had always had like low blood pressure, and conventional doctors would be like, wow, your blood pressure looks great. It's so low. And then functional doctors would be like, how are you walking? Like, your blood pressure is so low. No wonder you're so fatigued. And so my fatigue and my blood pressure completely resolved, like normalized, right? After utilizing thiamine. And I ended up, maybe a year or two later, I released my book, Hashimoto's The Root Cause. And I ended up writing an article about thiamine and how this is like this one nutrient and could it be the answer to your thyroid fatigue? This was over 10 years ago. I get like random people at conferences that'll come up and like hug me and thank me for my thiamine article because it changed their life. I've had people like on disability who started to take thiamine and now they're working again. People who were too tired to care for, there was this one lovely woman, she had horses and she hadn't been able to like care for them or ride them because of her extreme fatigue. And she's like sending me pictures of her riding her horses and caring for her horses. And it's just such an incredible, underutilized, inexpensive, non toxic nutrient. Can you explain to us perhaps why it might be so effective for thyroid related fatigue? What mechanisms might be at play?
Yeah, yeah. Before that, I'd just like to say that I have many. I run a group, over 10,000 people. I'm in contact with many, many, many more. I get lots of emails on a daily basis from random people. Many of them actually find that article that you wrote. They have Hashimoto's or they have some other kind of thyroid dysfunction, and that is how they discover thiamine, and then subsequently get in contact with me or find my work. So Yeah, I just want to echo that statement that really that article that you originally wrote, and the case study was by a neurologist. He unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. He's based in Italy. I think you're talking about the one by Antonio Costantini,
Yes, sir. Hmm.
and he had some marvelous case studies on other conditions as well, and really paved the way for or opened the door for so many people who come into contact with his work. So yeah, that's that. I'm really happy that you discovered it. It's just a real shame that there is not many more people who are discussing this or even aware of this, especially in the alternative or functional medicine community where there's so much focus on other nutrients and other supplements, and yet something which could have such miraculous and immediate effects really does not get a fraction of the attention it deserves. And that's ultimately what made me so interested in it, because I had started seeing some similar cases of individuals who would come to me for some condition, and I would trial them on thiamine in hopes that it would help a particular symptom, and then actually all of their symptoms or 90% of their symptoms disappeared in a very short period of time. And this was, 6 or 7 years ago now. I was wondering, but why is there barely anyone talking about this? There's a handful of people who've specialized and have spoken about it, but this is not common knowledge. And so that was really one of the reasons why I dug so deep into it, and it's really become an obsession over these, past 6 years. I've basically dedicated my life to it. I didn't choose to do that; it just happened. Um, and so you mentioned that the mechanism by which this might work for someone with a thyroid condition. So there's a substantial overlap between thyroid conditions, whether it be Hashimoto's, whether it be generalized hypothyroidism, even hyperthyroidism, and a deficiency or a lack of this particular vitamin. This vitamin, also known as vitamin B1, was first discovered, and it is an easy way to conceptualize this is it's really important for how your cells take the food components, so whether that be your carbohydrate, your protein, and your fat, and convert that into usable energy. And why does this tie in with thyroid? Well, we know that thyroid is basically like the gas pedal. You've got your car, if you're driving the car, and thyroid is like putting down the gas. And in hypothyroidism, you see a decline in all of these metabolic processes. But in particular, you see this decline in the rate of energy metabolism. Well, an analogy that you might want to work with is if you have someone with a thyroid condition and you don't have enough gas. Well, if thyroid is like putting the gas pedal down, then the machinery inside the cell which makes the energy is like the engine, and thiamine is really important for how that engine is working. And so even if hypothetically, if you have someone who has a thyroid condition and they start improving their thyroid function, or they take exogenous thyroid hormones, they're putting the gas down. But if the engine still doesn't work, the car's not going to drive as it should, right? And so where thiamine comes in is thiamine is what is called a coenzyme for different enzymes, or it's a cofactor for different enzymes in your cells, which help you convert food molecules or the breakdown products of food into usable energy. And if you don't have enough B1, then you can't do that very well. It's really important for, particularly for the brain, particularly for the heart, and particularly for the peripheral nerves. And if someone is low in thiamine, then it's usually, from a conventional medical standpoint, it's going to lead to some symptoms, any number of symptoms in any of those systems. But if we take a much broader perspective and we consider thiamine is really integral, and I would say probably the most important vitamin for how your cells make usable energy, then theoretically a low levels of B1 could affect any organ or any tissue or anywhere in the body. And one of the main presenting symptoms of a thyroid condition is usually, or from my experience, is going to be fatigue. And so if you think if someone has um, can't take their food and convert that into usable energy, then one of the signs and symptoms, or one of the main signs and symptoms of that, is going to be fatigue. And there's many ways that you could potentially look into this, and I don't know how deep you would want to go into it, but something that I think your listeners really need to comprehend is that thiamine, a way that Derek Lonsdale, probably the world expert, unfortunately he passed away last year, the way that he would describe it is that all of your nutrients, you need all of your nutrients to do things in the cells, to basically to survive, to live. to conduct anything that your cells need to do, you need micronutrients. So your vitamins, your minerals, other cofactors that you're getting from food. Now, you can think of this collection of nutrients that your cells need to maintain a state of health. It's like an orchestra. But the where thiamine comes in is thiamine is like the conductor of that orchestra. So without enough B1, it doesn't matter if you've got all of the other members of the orchestra, they're not going to play in tune. And so, yeah, and mechanistically, there's various reasons for this. Without going into too much detail, what your listeners might should probably understand is that thiamine is really important for these enzymes, particular enzymes, which are what are called rate limiting. And what that means is that their activity when they're working, their activity governs numerous downstream steps of metabolism. So they're like entry points. One of those is called pyruvate dehydrogenase. Another one is called alpha ketoglutarate dehydrogenase. And these are really important junctures in how the cell determines what it's going to do with molecules, whether it's going to use them to build things up or whether it's going to use them to make energy. And these key rate limiting enzymes, if they don't have enough thiamine, they slow down. And what that means is that every other downstream step also slows down. So you can have enough B12, you can have enough folate, enough riboflavin, enough vitamin C, enough vitamin D. But if you don't have enough thiamine, then it's kind of irrelevant. And I say that's an oversimplified way of saying it, but really in terms of how your cells are going to make energy, it becomes somewhat irrelevant because they cannot do it without enough B1. And in that case, if your cells don't have energy, which is made in the mitochondria, then that translates to disease. And in the thyroid, it can translate to hypothyroidism. In the brain, it can translate to Alzheimer's disease. In the heart, it can translate to heart failure. All ultimately at their root, in many respects, comes down to dysfunctional energy production at the level of the mitochondria. And since thiamine is so important for mitochondrial function, then yeah, that's I would say that's one of the main reasons why it is so important.
I love that. And so much to unpack here. Thank you for going deep with us in the mechanism of action. I think for me, one of the things that I've found interesting as a pharmacist, pharmacologist is like you, when I learned about it, it was like if you have, beriberi, or if you have this other condition where it was like, if you're super deficient and we can test this in your blood, where there it's not necessarily always tied to like a deficiency, right? And you can't always measure the deficiency. And I came across like a concept with like mega dosing and receptor stimulation for not just thiamine, but various different nutraceuticals where, yes, they can replenish a deficiency, but also they have a way of stimulating receptors. So, in a way, they act like a pharmacological agent, and, this isn't a bad thing, right? Can you maybe talk about like, do you test people for thiamine deficiency? Do you assess them? And where do you think about that? Like, are we addressing a nutrient deficiency? Are we addressing, are we trying to simulate those receptors? Like, what I was hoping you could go a little bit deeper into that. Because I know some people are like, oh, well, my doctor tested me and I'm not deficient for, the same kind of things I'm sure you hear from people in your audience.
Of course, and I think this is probably the area of research that I find the most fascinating, and I think it's one of the biggest stumbling blocks to broadening the awareness of the potential benefits or utility of this nutrient in the wider community of medicine or functional medicine or alternative medicine. And I think because there is such a reliance on testing, and whether that be conventional testing. So I'll give an example. Conventional tests would typically look at measuring your levels of thiamine floating around in the blood. Or if you get a bit more of a fancy test, it might measure the amount in your blood cell. So what does that ultimately tell you? Well, a doctor is going to usually rely on that to give them an indication of whether you're low or not. But really, in reality, all that tells you is you have enough in the blood. And there could be lots of reasons why you might have enough in the blood. It could be that your meal that you were digesting from last night had enough thiamine in it. And so what we know from the research is that the level in the blood does not correlate necessarily with the level inside the cells in different organs and tissues. That's one thing. Now, functional medicine comes along and it says, look, we acknowledge this doesn't really work. So, what we do instead is we use these more sensitive markers, let's say, and we measure different metabolites. So, there's what's called an organic acids test, and that is probably, I would say, one of the gold standards in terms of assessing a genuine deficiency. And the reason for that is because rather what that's looking at is it's looking at indirect markers of metabolism that are going to become elevated or low in someone whose enzymes are not working because they're low in thiamine. Remember, we were talking about thiamine is a cofactor for these important enzymes. So the idea is that you might see, for instance, elevations in lactic acid, elevations in pyruvate, elevations in alpha ketoglutarate. There are several different markers that might come up, and then what ends up happening is they're spilled out into the urine. And so this is, I think, for the most part, a better way of measuring various nutrient deficiencies, because what it's doing is actually telling you in real time, and it's giving you an idea of what's actually happening inside the cells, and that's great. But the problem is that if you really dig into the literature, which is what I've done, and I've spent several years doing it and speaking to some of the world experts in these fields and trying to really get my head around this, it turns out that when it comes to people who are responsive to thiamine, a lot of the research suggests that these markers are not abnormal. There's no indication of a deficiency in the classical sense that would show up on a test. And how can we explain that? That seems really bizarre. But we see that there are sometimes miraculous recoveries from some supposedly incurable conditions. Some examples would be Parkinson's disease, which is considered incurable. It's a terrible neurological condition. Well, if you look at many of the blood tests done on thiamine on Parkinson's patients, their thiamine levels, even their active thiamine levels in the blood or in the red blood cells, are normal. And yet, in some case studies, these patients have been put into clinical remission using thiamine. So, again, how can we explain that? Well, it comes down to what the evidence really does suggest, and I believe to be 100% true, is a concept of a localized deficiency or a mishandling, so to speak. And when I say deficiency, I think we need to broaden our definition of deficiency. So deficiency is classically associated with not consuming enough in the diet. But it's actually way more complicated than that, because a deficiency can occur at the level of a single cell. And there's various reasons for that. It might be that a cell can't uptake enough of the nutrient. It might be the cell runs through it really quickly. It might be that there's something in that cell which is either destroying the nutrient or stopping the ability of the cell to use the nutrient. So you end up with a condition where the cell is technically deficient, although it might have enough floating around, it just can't use it. Okay. So we call this like a functional deficiency. And so I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but the key point that I really want to emphasize is that you can be or functionally deficient in a single region of the body, in a single group of cells, in a tissue, in an organ. And they found this in the brain, they found this in the heart. And we're just about to publish a paper, and we believe that there's evidence for this in the gut as well. Now, coming back to blood tests and then functional tests, well, okay, you measure the total number of metabolites coming out in the urine. You might find that if other areas of the body do not have this mishandling or this faulty processing of this nutrient, but it's only localized to a certain region of the brain or the heart, let's say, then that's not going to change the systemic level of metabolites coming out in the urine. Likewise, it's not going to change the total amount in the blood. They find something similar in Alzheimer's disease. So, in Parkinson's, for instance, they found a localized deficiency in the region of the brain, the substantia nigra, which degenerates in that condition. Likewise, in Alzheimer's disease, they're finding that there is a localized or functional deficiency in the brain, but normal levels in the blood. Similar things have been found with ALS, Huntington's disease. They literally just discovered that like 3 years ago. In Huntington's disease, another one of these really nasty neurodegenerative conditions, they found that there's a problem with transport of thiamine into these specific regions of the brain. And they actually treated mice with high doses of B1 in conjunction with biotin and completely reversed the phenotype of this condition, currently in human trials. So what we know, this is a principle which is a really uphill battle to try and convey to people, because it goes against the grain, let's say. But I think it is key to understanding why this can work for so many people, but also why one should not rely on testing, because testing cannot assess this kind of issue. Now, you mentioned receptors or enzymes or this concept of high doses, and this is where the concept of using thiamine in a pharmacological dose will work. And I want to come back to some of those case studies with the doctor that you mentioned in who had found thiamine to really improve fatigue in some of these Hashimoto's patients. Well, he had done several other case studies, and one of those in particular was in patients in fibromyalgia. It was small. However, there are now tens of thousands of people in the online groups and communities who are using this to treat fibromyalgia. And what he found was that he had 3 patients, quite severe fatigue and pain scores. He found he started them on a dose which was relatively low at 500 milligrams per day, and this was just normal thiamine, no change. Up to 1,000 milligrams, no change. Up to 1,500 milligrams, barely any change. However, when they reached 1,800 milligrams, which, to give your listeners some context, the recommended daily allowance of thiamine is only about 1 milligram, 1 to 1.5 milligram. So we're talking upwards of 1,000 times what you could ever get from food. This is what's called a pharmacological dose. There's no way that you would ever achieve that from anything natural, right? So when they reached above 1,000 times the RDA, they noticed an overnight change. And we're not just talking about a gradual improvement. No, we're talking about from one day to the next, there was no symptom changes. So these people had severe fatigue and severe pain, to literally overnight, within less than 24 hours, major improvements, up to 80% improvement in pain, up to like 60% improvement in fatigue overnight. And he called that the all or nothing effect. So the question is, how can anyone explain how this works? Because this is not just addressing a deficiency, like you'd mentioned. This is not a normal deficiency, because when in clinical practice, I'm a nutritionist, I've dealt with hundreds of people treating their deficiencies. You usually see a gradual improvement at much lower doses, but this is something different. And this is the kind of principle that people are using to improve their Hashimoto's or their thyroid, various symptoms in thyroid conditions. They're using it for chronic fatigue syndrome. I've got many people on it for fibromyalgia, and again, the neurodegenerative conditions. And also, we see a similar thing in functional gut disorders as well. So, in response to your question, this is a long-winded answer, but ultimately, you highlighted this concept of this pharmacological mechanism where it's working in a slightly different way. Now, there are several theories for why this might be working, and maybe the cause is different in different people. What we suspect is that in some cases, there are thyroid transporter polymorphisms, so problems with the genes encoding thyroid transporters. We also know that there are things which can impair or block thyroid transporter. Thiamine transporters, thiamine, thyroid. I'm getting confused. Thiamine transporters. So these transport proteins on the cell membrane which get the nutrient from the blood into the cell. There are problems with those transporters, and so in these people, they've got enough floating around the body, they can't get it into the cell. And another potential mechanism is that we know many of these chronic disease processes, things which lead to oxidative stress, things which lead to inflammation, neuroinflammation, chronic infection, so the chemicals that are released by stealth pathogens, what they can do is they can block the activity of specific enzymes. And it's ironic because when you look at a chronically diseased cell, what you often find is that this kind of chemical milieu that's present in the cell is putting a block on these very key enzymes. And it just so happens, it's ironic, they're exactly the rate limiting thiamine dependent enzymes that we were talking about at the start of this podcast. Primarily pyruvate dehydrogenase, alpha ketoglutarate dehydrogenase. They're very sensitive to these environmental toxins, these different disease processes, and the chemicals that come with that. So the concept is, which has been put forth by several researchers, is that by giving extremely high doses, what you can potentially do is take the block off of these enzymes, take the metabolic block off of these enzymes, and reinitiate them to start working again. And in so doing, you are re-engaging energy metabolism when it's been completely blocked by factors unrelated to dietary intake. And I think that's the overall principle. And there's many other things, non-coenzyme effects and things that we could probably talk for hours on. But I think that's what you may be alluding to. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think another paper that I saw from Costanzi was looking at actually dosing by weight. So my husband, he was shortly after we had our son, he was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. And we thankfully were able to get him into remission very quickly. I had just taken a course through IFM on how to get inflammatory bowel disease into remission. And I had three amazing friends who specialize in inflammatory bowel disease. And we were able to get him into remission from his digestive symptoms, but he had a lot of like residual fatigue. He went from the kind of person that would like wake up at 5 a.m. and like train for a marathon to like barely waking up at like 11 every single day and just constantly feeling exhausted. So I was like, okay, well, let's see if we can give you some thiamine because that can be a really, really big game changer. And I know with there's like the GI absorption can impair if you've got an inflamed gut, then you're not going to be absorbing your nutrients properly, including thiamine. And I came across some work that he did with dosing based on weight. And I realized, 600 milligrams was working really well for me and a lot of my thyroid ladies, right? Maybe some people might need a much higher dose than that. And I started to like really look into, okay, is this going to be safe? We generally know that B vitamins are are safe for the most part. There was one thing I do remember he talked about. I think it was like, was it palpitations that people would get if they're overdosed too quickly? Can you talk through that? Maybe like the safety and tolerability, like what dose is going to be, I guess, too high? And are we worried about high doses of this? Because I can tell you, like, if you were like high dose iodine, I'm like, no, no, no. Like this is a narrow therapeutic index. Iron is narrow therapeutic index. Selenium. There's a lot of vitamins and minerals and nutrients where I'm like, this is like the narrow therapeutic index. And same with like B6, which is another one of the vitamins. I'm like, if you get above a certain threshold, you're going to have a lot of neuropathies. Can you give us a little bit of insight in your experience about thiamine? Like, are we worried about the mega doses, right? I went to this beautiful lady does face acupuncture for me because I'm not 30 anymore to see if it could improve my face and collagen. And she was like, I get somebody on a high dose of thiamine. I was really worried about them. I was like, and my perspective, I was like, oh, you don't have to worry about that, but I would love to know your perspective.
Yeah, of course. As a general answer to that question, thiamine is completely non-toxic, and this applies to the thiamine derivatives as well. We'll talk about those later. Basically, all of the different types of thiamine available on the market are remarkably safe, meaning that they can be taken in several thousand times the RDA. Um, eh, Before causing any problem, it would probably lead to digestive expulsion, as in, for instance, if you were to get anywhere close to the supposed toxic dose, which is really high, you would probably be getting rid of it in the toilet way before you ever got to that point. So that's to say that if you're not injecting it or you haven't got an IV drip, it's almost impossible to overdose on, and it doesn't have any toxic effects, not at the liver, not anywhere in the body. So it is considered a non-toxic vitamin. It doesn't have those side effects. It doesn't build up. It doesn't accumulate. The body, even with the fat soluble forms, they're not fat soluble in the context of accumulating in tissue, like say the genuine fat soluble vitamins are, like vitamin D, A, E, and K. So it's water soluble primarily, and it is going to be excreted. So the body will get rid of what it doesn't need. That is the simple answer to the question. But in practical terms, I would say outside of the realm of genuine toxicity and causing actual injury, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy to supplement with. And what I mean by that is that when someone who needs it, and this was a term which was coined by the pioneer in in high dose thiamine therapy. His name is Dr. Derek Lonsdale. I mentioned him before, and he was studying this for the best part of 5 decades. And he was a pediatrician at Cleveland Clinic, and he began using high doses of thiamine in different derivatives in neurological conditions, primarily postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, autism, other types of dysautonomia. And that his theory was that most dysautonomia was stemming from some kind of a deficiency in B1. And I have come to agree with him in many respects. By the by, he came up with the concept of what's called the paradoxical reaction. What that basically refers to is, paradoxically, if someone's body really needs thiamine or could potentially benefit from it, when they take it, sometimes it can make their symptoms worse. Now, that is not the same as having a toxic effect. So we have to differentiate here. Symptoms doesn't necessarily mean that it's causing any kinds of toxicity. There can be lots of reasons why someone might develop symptoms, and that is really quite common when someone starts thiamine. And so the reason why it's paradoxical is because you would think if you have a deficiency, or if your body has a need for this thing which can really help it, you would think that wouldn't cause a problem, but it does, and that's the paradoxical element to it. And so the overall principle is that when you take thiamine, what can happen is that the original symptoms which you're trying to address can sometimes get temporarily worse. And the way that this kind of goes is that you might take a dose of thiamine, and then you might notice that you say you want to improve fatigue. You might notice that your fatigue gets a little bit worse for maybe a couple of days. And then you might notice that it actually comes back up to baseline, or it might be slightly improved. And so then you would increase the dose of thiamine, and then once again it goes downhill, and then it actually comes up past baseline, and then it's a little bit improved above from where you started. And so over time, and it can be over the space of days or weeks, or in some very sensitive or chronically ill individuals, it can take months to get to the point where they reach what is called the therapeutic dose. And therapeutic dose is different for each person. I've personally found that it doesn't correlate with body weight, but I do understand Costantini's dosing protocol and why he would do that. But I've personally found that there are some individuals, I've worked with 40 kilogram women who are like 4'11", um, who need 2 grams of thiamine to achieve the effect. And then likewise, I've worked with guys who are 6'5" and who are like 100 kg, and they only need 300 milligrams. So it really does differ from person to person. But what I can usually say is that I think the vast majority of people don't notice any kind of worsening in symptoms, but there are a subset of people, and I think usually the people who have any kind of a chronic illness, usually the more chronic and the more extreme it is, particularly people with like fibro, CFS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. These are the individuals that typically do notice quite a worsening of symptoms. And there's lots of theories for why this might be, but in long story short, I believe it can come down to an imbalance that thiamine might be causing with other nutrients. And so what you find is that if you use it in conjunction with other nutrients, Lonsdale always insisted that someone take a generalized B complex behind taking thiamine and taking magnesium. And I would agree with that, but I would also add potassium on board to that as well, because I found that many of the symptoms, sometimes someone might feel fatigue, they might notice an increased heart rate, increase in blood pressure, decrease in blood pressure, headache, these kind of things. They can usually be resolved within a couple of hours of taking either potassium, magnesium, or one of the other complex of the B vitamins. And so I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that people make, is they will just take thiamine by itself. They'll notice some of these changes in symptoms, and they might not like it, and they don't know what to anticipate. And the way you think of your metabolism, it's basically you've got this car engine, let's say, and there's lots of different moving parts of that car engine. And what thiamine is doing, particularly when you give it in high dose, you're kind of you're speeding up some of these cogs in the machine. But what that's doing is it's having knock-on effects on other cogs, which are not affected by B1. And so it's increasing the demand for nutrients across the board. That's what we think is probably happening. So you speed up one part, and other things also need speeding up, and that can increase your demand. And so giving a B complex behind it, giving magnesium, giving potassium, is in 90% of cases, that's going to suffice. Now, when you get into the more complex cases, that's when you need to be a little bit more. It's as much of an art as it is a science. So that's when you have to be a little bit more individualized in terms of exactly what nutrient you might add or you might take away. But that as a general rule for most people, it's quite simple. You take high dose thiamine, you just take a B complex, magnesium, potassium behind it, and you should be good to go.
That makes so much sense because I typically see people tolerating it pretty well, but I'm also a big advocate of magnesium, electrolytes, and also like a B complex. Whenever I support people with fatigue, a lot of people with thyroid have thyroid fatigue. So my kind of protocol is like adrenal adaptogens, B vitamins, vitamin C, magnesium, electrolytes, and mitochondrial support. And that I feel like that works really, really well in synergy. And yes, thiamine is an amazing nutrient, but it's like, we can't just like live in a tunnel and have and say just like one nutrient. So I love that you talk about how you combine it with additional things. And absolutely, when you speed up metabolism, of course, like you're going to be deficient in electrolytes. And that really explains, I feel like, the mechanism between like the heart rate and the palpitations that might occur. Um, my experience has been that we oftentimes start thiamine for thyroid fatigue, and then other things sort of go away that I'm always learning. So I'm like, oh, cool. Yeah. Yeah. That went away too. And it's like things I didn't realize would go away. Whenever I work with clients and I start recommending things, or I hear from readers where they're like, oh, I tried this and this random thing just went away. So I have seen POTS going away. So I have seen a lot of like adrenal fatigue or adrenal issues going away, SIBO going away. I was hoping, I know we've shared a few things. We've just in speaking about the various symptoms that can improve. Can you give us maybe a little bit of a more insight or a list of additional things that you've seen, maybe some things that have surprised you?
Indeed, and it never fails to surprise me. So, starting with the gut, and this is actually, I think, one of the most overlooked organs of a deficiency. But it seems as though what the body might do is actually prioritize other organs. It will prioritize the brain, heart, because you need those to survive. And what it might do, what we think it does, is that it's actually the gut is being kind of, it's like the last organ. It's like the least important. It's constantly turning around. So it's like the body will say, okay, we haven't got enough of this, so we're going to give it everywhere else. But actually, we might get some more in the gut. And so basically, any condition of the digestive system which involves impaired motility or impaired secretion, and that's quite widespread. So you think in the stomach, this could be impaired motility or control of the sphincters. And that means you can have GERD, you can have gastroparesis because the stomach doesn't propel food. You can't get it from the stomach into the intestine. You can have gastroesophageal reflux, and you can have any type of imbalance with stomach acid. So it can be elevated stomach acid or it could be decreased stomach acid. In fact, this was one of the first symptoms that they discovered in the 1940s, one of the earliest studies on thyroid deficiency in man. They found that every single subject developed stomach acid problems. And of course, you can replace that with HCl. But next, anything with the intestine. So if it is intestinal inflammation, intestinal permeability, these are direct signs. They can be direct signs and symptoms of a lack of thiamine in the intestine because you need thiamine to control the inflammatory response. It does this through the vagus nerve and what's called the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway. And you need thiamine to control those tight junctions. And this is why it makes me so annoyed when I see gut protocols, and I've done two of the big functional medicine training programs, and not one of them mentioned thiamine for sealing up the gut. And that actually, in the research, it shows that's a direct effect that it has on the gut. Anything with intestinal dysmotility, it can be constipation, it can be diarrhea, it can be SIBO, it can be any kind of idiopathic constipation. I had a lady with ulcerative colitis who put that into remission with B1, and I've actually seen that several times since that point several years ago. And we believe we might know the mechanism for that, but I won't go there just yet. That's in the paper coming up. So any kind of inflammatory condition of the gut, any problem with pancreatic release either of insulin. You need thiamine to release insulin. Any problem with pancreatic exocrine insufficiency. So it can be if you do a stool test and you see low pancreatic enzymes, that or low pancreatic elastase, that can be a sign as well. So this is going to be in terms symptoms: undigested food, bloating, abdominal pain, reflux, and problems with your stool. Now, in terms of other symptoms, like I mentioned, anything to do with the brain. So it can be anhedonia, it can be insomnia, it can be excessive daytime sleepiness. So it goes either way. You can sleep too much or not enough. It can be depersonalization or any kind of just generalized depression. And this is kind of where it overlaps with hypothyroidism, because ultimately the signs and symptoms in the brain stemming from a lack of energy because of hypothyroidism, well, the same thing occurs in thiamine deficiency as well. You can see any problem with coordinating balance, with your heart rate, with anything that you don't have to consciously control. So pertaining to the autonomic nervous system. So that is, like I said, your sweat response, your body temperature, your vascular function. So whether enough blood gets to your peripheral organs. So this can manifest as dizziness. It can manifest as vertigo. It can manifest as being cold all of the time, feeling as though you're hypothyroid when you're not. Maybe you're not actually hypothyroid, because it can present in many of those similar ways. Um, in the heart, it can lead to any kind of palpitations. It can lead to low output heart failure, but that's very end stage. Really, I'm learning as we go again and again and again that I try to put thiamine deficiency into a single box, and then it just keeps getting wider. And so I'm seeing different people with different symptoms all of the time come and say that it improved them. So I don't really know how to answer that question. If you ask me in a year's time, it will probably be different. And I can't think off the top of my head. There's a lot. Ultimately, things pertaining to every organ. I mean, I had someone the other day saying that it fixed their psoriasis. You know, how does that work? I have no idea. Probably something to do with mitochondria. But thiamine's not a skin considered a skin specific nutrient like biotin or something like that. But ultimately, we're having people address their skin conditions with this as well. Um, but yeah, diabetes, another one. Again, people, carbohydrate intolerance, that is probably the single most common. So I get a lot of guys on, say, a carnivore diet or something, and they do it because they can't consume carbohydrates. They might not be diabetic, although it can improve diabetes via several different mechanisms. They might not be diabetic, but when they eat carbohydrates, and this really applies to anyone, if someone eats carbohydrates and feels sluggish, feels low in energy, or feels like hyper adrenergic, so it activates their stress response, or it leads to some kind of a negative set of symptoms: sugar, carbohydrates, anything high in starch. We've seen that eradicate within like a couple of days, and that's really common. Oftentimes those people just need more B1.
Incredible. And we do know there are certain things that can cause depletions in thiamine. I know I'm a big proponent of treating gut infections. If you have, let's say, Giardia, or if you have blastocystis hominis, this can really mess with your digestive tract, and this can contribute to IBS. It can contribute to malabsorption, thyroid issues, so on and so forth. And sometimes people will treat those with herbal remedies. Sometimes they'll utilize medications. Um, Flagyl, one of the common medications used, metronidazole um, for these kind of protozoal infections. Sometimes it's used for SIBO. This can actually produce a profound deficiency in thiamine. And I know I've had people who developed peripheral neuropathy post utilizing medications. And in some cases, it's like, thiamine is what's going to help them turn things around. Typically, people think of like alpha lipoic acid for peripheral neuropathy. And I would probably do both. But medications can cause a loss of thiamine, right? I can't really track down if Alinea, the medication, another antiprotozoal medication that's very popular in the United States. And it's kind of a new generation metronidazole that I feel like works better and has fewer side effects. That may potentially interfere with thiamine receptors as well. And that can be potentially something that can deplete thiamine levels. high sugar diet, malabsorption, these are some additional reasons why people might be deficient. Alcohol intake. Are there other kind of situations where you see perhaps a cause and effect between lifestyle or medications or anything that people have in their lives that might be correlated?
The most common is alcoholism, of course. Another one is any coexisting like comorbidity. It's usually going to be digestive conditions, gut infections, like you said. Not only can dysbiosis destroy thiamine, but it can also produce thiamine analogs, which have like an anti-thiamine effect, and just inflammation in the gut. So if you have any kind of inflammatory condition, then the inflammatory cytokines block thiamine absorption in the intestines. That's really important. It's called hypoxia inducible factor, literally turns off the thiamine transporter in the intestine. So that's really important because that means that any condition which causes any kind of gut inflammation immediately can cause quite a substantial depletion or an inhibition of your ability to absorb thiamine from the gut. Now, some other key risk factors. One, like you said, metronidazole flagyl, and the way that that works is it produces a thiamine analog. Not only does it block thiamine from getting into the cells, but then it can actually stop how cells use it. And so there's a condition called metronidazole induced encephalopathy, which is very similar. It's not identical, but it's very similar to Wernicke encephalopathy, which is like end stage thiamine deficiency. And there's an entire group run by a lovely lady. I believe her name is Erin Jensen. And her group is made up of several thousand members, and she went through the process of discovering she'd taken metronidazole, looked at the symptoms, saw how similar they were to B1 deficiency, and actually done a lot of the research and put two and two together. And now she guides people on how to fix that. So a lot of people in that community who've been damaged by that antibiotic can resolve it with the right type of thiamine derivative. But there's lots of other drugs as well. That's the problem. Not all of them have been studies. I mean, many antibiotics in general. So trimethoprim. Um, what else is there? There's there's a host of pharmaceuticals. Let me just say that, and there's a very good list online, particularly on Hormones Matter website. A lot of pharmaceuticals will cause a lack of B1. There are thiamine inhibitors in certain foods. So one of those is tannins, for instance, coffee.
Is it
I
in
don't.
tea?
It's in tea. However, I'm not really concerned about that. That's going to add to like a total. There's going to be numerous factors. So just drinking tea or coffee is not going to cause a deficiency in B1. It's if someone is drinking a high amount of alcohol, only drinks tea, also doesn't consume much from the diet and eats tons of sugar. Well, that's a recipe for disaster. But in general, I would say that's probably the lowest on the list of priorities. But then if we look at the things which aren't very well characterized, well, one of them which the conventional medical community kind of acknowledges is just consumption of any refined food. It's Lonsdale called it high calorie malnutrition, which is like in the Western world, it's crazy. But it was originally discovered in the East because what they started doing was they took rice. Previously, they would consume rice as brown rice, but the brown part actually contained the thiamine. And so when they started polishing rice, actually making what we now know as white rice, well, they started seeing that there were mass deficiencies. And that spurred a lot of research and stuff. And they eventually discovered it was the thiamine that they were taking out and the other B vitamins, of course, but mostly the thiamine. And that's why it kind of showed us, you know, let's put it this way: you use twice as much B1 or twice as much thiamine to metabolize carbohydrates for energy as you would other macronutrients. And so if you've got someone who consumes a lot of sugar or a lot of white rice that's not fortified, and then also drinks alcohol, and then also has some of these things, then you're looking at a recipe for disaster. And I would say it's probably the single most common deficiency, but it's not very well tested and it's not very well understood. It's by far the most common nutritional deficiency that I see. But then again, my patient population is probably quite biased because people seek me out because of this. So I can't really speak to that. However, there are also a couple of other things which I would say if you're going to be looking out for, or you have any practitioners who are listening to this, anyone with any kind of increased demand on their body. So that can be a stressful life event. Physiological and psychological slash emotional stress both cause temporary depletions in B1. That's been established in animal literature. Thiamine allows the body to adapt to stress via several different mechanisms, and stress in and of itself, not necessarily just emotional, but also activation of the HPA axis, decreases thiamine stores in like most of the organs. Chronic cellular stress is going to increase the turnover and demand for thiamine. So if you've got someone who's running a marathon, for instance, you've got someone who is a bodybuilder who's consuming not only a lot of white rice and egg whites and things like that and sugary drinks and whatever, but then they're going to the gym 5 or 6 days a week. That is considered a stressor. Anything, if they've got a chronic illness, like we were talking about, chronic disease, if they're in hospital, well, they're at a particularly high risk. There was one statistic, I can't remember exactly the percentage, but it was something like chronically ill patients, when they were first admitted to the ICU, it was like 10% were deficient. And then within a week of being there, like 90% of them were deficient. So the disease process itself is using up your nutrients, in particular B1. Now, also, one last thing that I'd like to mention, and this is right up your lane, is hyperthyroidism. So, hyperthyroid, because it has this stimulating effect on metabolism, what that means is you're burning through everything. And that was in the early days, that was considered one of the main risk factors for developing this. And in many cases, the hyperthyroid symptoms could be improved by just taking vitamin B1. That was something interesting as well. So yeah, there's quite a lot of things. I don't have enough time to go through all of it, but yeah.
Yeah, for sure. With like hyperthyroidism, I find that carnitine can work really, really well and thiamine. And interestingly, these were initially used in overactive thyroid, right? And to help with like the muscle wasting and some of the consequences. But in recent years, I've been using a lot of carnitine and thiamine for people with hypothyroid fatigue. And that works really, really well, that combination. One thing I wanted to share is, as a mom, I'm always doing like research like the FBI, right? And looking through all kinds of things. But one really scary thing for kids is in Israel, I think this was in 2000, early 2000s, they had released a soy based formula that was thiamine deficient. And there were babies with like irreversible brain damage because they were thiamine deficient. I know I have an incredible colleague, Dr. Erica Pearson, who works with kids with Down syndrome, and she actually uses thiamine to help with like their development. And it's just so fascinating because, we're very much like in the chronic world of chronic illness with adults, but a lot of these things can be very relevant for children. Do you work at all with kids?
Yeah, yeah. In the past, I would have many parents, particularly neurodevelopmental disorders, including ASD. I work with several children with autism who, and again, I don't really like to talk so much about this publicly because I like to manage people's expectations, and sometimes parents can be, they can have high expectations and really put their faith in a particular therapy, and if it doesn't work, it can be quite, let's say, disempowering, let's say. But we have seen, and I know Lonsdale specialized in autism. He saw thousands of kids with autism. um, I've seen some children regain speech using B1. And there are tons. I know Erica Pearson does a lot of work with children, and that's fantastic. I also follow her. I'm friends with her online. Yeah, anything which pertains to neurological development, and also not just in the brain. This is really, you think of thiamine being synonymous with the neurological system, or having a high affinity for the neurological system, even outside of its role inside cells. So we know that what thiamine does is it has a very close relationship with the neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Now you find acetylcholine is particularly important not only for mood, cognition, and brain function in general, arousal, attention, but it's involved in how the nervous system communicates to the rest of the body and controls all of the different organs. Like we were talking about the heart, we're talking about the digestive system, the vascular system. All of these get inputs from the brain ultimately through this nervous system. A lot of that involves the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And so if you don't have enough B1, one of the first things that will happen is you lose the ability to make acetylcholine. Now, there seems to be a connection with kids with ASD, kids with speech difficulties, speech impediments. There are problems with how neurons are communicating with each other. And actually using cholinergics, or using thiamine in this case, well, not only is it improving like the energy aspect that we were talking about, but it's also having very important effects on neurological cell-to-cell communication. And I think that's probably one of the ways in which it's working. Several different mechanisms by which it might help ASD. I've spoken about it in the past. But yeah, it really, 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 really important for the nervous system.
Yeah, it's just fascinating because it's like one nutrient and it can do so much. So my most of my experience in what I've recommended to my clients and what I used personally was benfotiamine, and this is known as a fat soluble version of thiamine. There's also like straight up thiamine, right? Like there's you can also use injectable thiamine and a few other forms of thiamine, and I feel like sometimes you can utilize one and maybe that's not the best fit for you. I would love for you to speak to more of like the different versions that are out there, maybe some of the pros and cons and what makes them different. I know a lot of the questions I get are like, is okay, so you talk about fat soluble vitamins, and as a pharmacist, I'm always like, fat soluble vitamins, they can build up in your system. Make sure you check your levels. And then people see that benfotiamine is fat soluble and they're like, wait a minute, the RDA is this, but I'm using this much. Is this going to be an issue? So I'm hoping that you can speak a little bit more to that with regard to what are the different dosage forms, and is there one that might work for different people better, and yeah, when to kind of think about switching.
So there's a couple different forms, like you mentioned. There's standard thiamine, and it's water soluble. It doesn't accumulate or anything like that. And these are called thiamine salts. And in 90% of supplements that you look at on Amazon or you go to the store, it's going to be one of these two forms. So it's called thiamine hydrochloride and thiamine mononitrate. And it's a very simple molecular structure. The thiamine, the vitamin, bound to like a little salt. Okay. And for a lot of people, this has good effects. It can help, and many of the research studies are using this particular the form because it's most widely available and it's very cheap. So some people find that this can be useful, but there are a substantial portion of the population that this doesn't really do anything for. So the pros and cons of this is that it's widely available and you can get it practically anywhere. But if you're going to use it, you generally need to use it in a very high dose. And the reason for that is quite simple, in that you've got these little transporters in your intestine that regulate the amount that you can absorb into the blood. And they're called saturable. What that means is they're only open for a short period of time. They can only allow a very small amount of B1 into the blood. And so after a short while, they close. And when they close, that means any extra B1 that's in your intestine is just going to stay there. You can't actually utilize it. And so the average kind of effective, no, the average amount that you're going to absorb when you use these forms is about 5%, if only 5%. Now, if you use a very high dose, there is some evidence that actually that can get some into the blood, but it also doesn't necessarily happen with cells, because what we have to understand is that these transporters not only regulate the amount that you're absorbing from the intestine into the blood, but it also regulates the amount that you can get into the brain, because you've got what's called the blood-brain barrier, and that's designed to protect your brain from all potentially toxic things in your blood. That has these transporters. So once again, they're a limiting factor. If you've got a problem in the brain and you give normal B1, well, it might not even get to the brain. That's the problem. And then when it does get to the brain, it has to get into the cells. Once again, we've got this problem of these transporters, which can be switched off when there's too much. So the Japanese in the 1960s developed about 15 different forms of B1. And the way that they did this was they took the thiamine molecule and they attached different chemical groups or molecular groups to the molecule and gave it very special properties. And so this has led to really three main forms in our in the Western world that we have available to us. And so one that you mentioned is benfotiamine, quite simple molecular structure, but what it contains this extra S-acyl group, or this benzoate, and what ends up happening is that when you absorb that into when you consume that, it bypasses these transporters. What that means is, in effect, you can get very high amounts of thiamine into the blood, which then goes into the brain and then goes into the cells. And so it's a really, really, really good way of increasing thiamine and getting it where it needs to go very quickly. And that's why they did this. And so you have three main types of derivatives. You have benfotiamine, you have sulbutamine, and you have TTFD. TTFD is the actual name of it, thiamine tetrahydrofurfuryl disulfide. It's a little bit of a hard thing to say, so we call it TTFD.
4 times fast. Say it 4 times fast, right?
I'm pro at it now, but still, it's I even stumble sometimes. So they all have pretty unique properties, but they all share some pretty important things in common. They can get into the blood to bypass transporters. They can get into the brain, and they can also get into cells. Now, what I found personally over the past 6 years, and the evidence kind of does substantiate this, is that each different form seems to have an affinity for, let's say, some different conditions or different symptoms or different organs. I'll give you an example. Benfotiamine has been heavily studied in peripheral neuropathy. Benfotiamine clinically is remarkable, in fact, at reducing the pain that you might see in peripheral neuropathy, but also in other pain conditions such as fibromyalgia. Benfotiamine can literally melt away the pain in some cases. It's also been studied in diabetes. It has interesting effects on diabetic complications at the cell level. It can improve glucose uptake. It can reduce hyperglycemic effects on the vascular system. And it has just overall some very interesting anti-inflammatory, antioxidant effects that you don't see with thiamine. And this is actually a point that I think your listeners need to understand, is that there's no equivalence between these derivatives and normal thiamine, because these derivatives, the extra chemical groups, give them qualities, unique properties that you do not find even with extremely high doses of B1. So there's actually something unique, what you might call pleiotropic effects of these molecules individually. And it differs between each different molecule as well. One of those is, like we're talking about benfotiamine. Well, that's being studied at the moment. The evidence in animals is very promising. However, it's being studied in human models, $300 million clinical trial at the moment in Alzheimer's disease, because they've been finding they can basically reverse all of the pathological effects of impaired glucose metabolism and the effects on the vascular system. They can effectively reverse those using high doses of benfo. So they're doing that in animals, and that's one of the affinities that benfo has. On the other hand, you have something like TTFD. Well, TTFD doesn't really have that many positive effects in Alzheimer's. However, TTFD is by far the best form to address any functional gut disorder. So for some reason, TTFD seems to have a very potent ability to improve the acetylcholine, or the cholinergic mechanisms of the vagus nerve communicating to the enteric neurons and controlling the stomach, controlling the sphincters, controlling the intestinal motility, controlling the intestinal secretion, reducing inflammation in the gut. And we know this from the studies as well, and this what you see clinically. So it's also usually the best form to use for postural orthostatic tachycardia or other forms of dysautonomia. Now, there can also be some overlap. But yeah, so benfotiamine, really good for peripheral neuropathy, peripheral pain, Alzheimer's disease, and general energy. TTFD, also energy, but very particular for functional gut disorders, and POTS dysautonomia conditions. Can also help with neuropathy as well. On the other hand, sulbutamine, very similar to TTFD. They both contain this extra sulfur. However, sulbutamine has been studied for its effect in primarily motivation, for problems with OCD, with problems with attention span, brain-specific effects. It's highly dopaminergic. So that means that it can help improve low dopamine states, can help improve asthenia, mental asthenia. And yeah, it's also an interesting molecule. Now, you can choose based on the condition. If you're a practitioner, I'm actually building a course specifically to certify doctors and other practitioners on how to use this, because I've got that many people who are looking for someone who knows about this stuff, but I don't take patients anymore. I don't have enough time for it. Um, but in simple terms, it's usually good to pick a form based on the presenting condition or symptoms that the patient presents with. Or what you can do is actually blend the forms. And that's what I like to do most of the time, because then you hit all of the bases. Like if you've got someone with chronic pain, but they've also got a functional gut disorder, you might use a combination of benfotiamine and TTFD because you know both of them help in that respect. You might also use some thiamine hydrochloride to build up the dose, because actually that doesn't necessarily hurt doing as well. And some people tolerate that a bit better. So, like I said, there's less of a science when it gets to the application. It's more of an art. And you have to kind of look at your patient and see what they have and weigh up the pros and cons of the different forms, but really looking at the affinity that those forms have for the different organ systems, and then deciding how to blend them or just to go with one form or another form, if that answers your question.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I'm glad that you mentioned that you can combine the forms. For some reason, in my mind, I had it like you choose one and you go with it, but that would make so much sense that you would use them synergistically. So I remember learning that silbutamine would be the best for brain function. And a few years back, I was experimenting with different forms. This is kind of like random, but I feel like silbutamine increased my body temperature, and then with TTFD, I kept smelling truffles. Have you heard anybody say things like that before?
Truffles. I've not heard that one. That's a first for sure. But we do have people smelling things. I think the reason for that might be is because TTFD has this extra sulfur group. What ends up happening is that you get into the cell, and this sulfur group detaches, and then you break that sulfur group down, and then you metabolize the sulfur compounds through the urine. But that means that you've got elevated sulfur compounds, which actually have important antioxidant effects. They have some beneficial effects, but those traveling around in the blood, if someone's sensitive, well, you can pick that up. Either you can taste it, or you can smell it, or other people can smell it. So there are some potential downsides with sulbutamine and TTFD in that they have this extra sulfur, and I think that might be what you were smelling, but I'm not sure.
I love truffles, but it was just very confusing 'cause for a while I was like, "Oh my gosh, am I having are we making truffles for dinner? This is amazing. I'm so excited." And then I couldn't find the truffles. And then it was like, am I having like olfactory hallucinations? What's happening, right?
Yeah, and if you look at the history, actually, this in Japan, they use what's called uh, the olfactory test. So they use TTFD specifically to measure someone's olfaction, and I think what they do is they inject it, and then they can assess the level of degeneration, because someone should be able to like taste and smell it, and if they can't, then that I don't know the exact mechanism, but it's so potent that they use that as a test in Japan. They still use it to this day. It's crazy.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, I know I've been told that I have an excellent sense of smell, like where it's like, okay, how do like this is quite impressive. So maybe I'm just somebody that is a little bit extra like that.
And you use it in yourself. Have you tried any of the different forms in the patients that you work with? I know that you said you use benfotiamine, but have you tried mixing and matching?
No, I've primarily used straight up thiamine and then benfotiamine. Typically, I would say majority of the people that I've worked with, I have had them on benfotiamine. So I'm so excited to learn about these um, the other forms as well. And I'm also excited that you've created your own supplement company, just because when you find supplements and then you look online and they come in like these like shady packages and you're like, am I really getting this, am I not getting this? So I haven't been as comfortable, to be honest with you, like recommending these other forms until I found your company, because I'm like, I don't know, like if I want to recommend something that is like, I don't know, you have to like order it through like the dark web, and you can only pay with like some crazy payment systems. So you've made like I know that you've created this and it's very high quality and you also deliver to the United States and Europe as well because I've had issues with trying to get the other forms in the past where I'm like I know there's these other amazing forms out there but I'm just like I'm a big proponent of quality as a pharmacist and just making sure that whatever I'm recommending I feel very confident in the quality of the manufacturing and all of that good stuff. So I'm like a biohacker and also a pharmacist. So there's like this big conflict because I'll try stuff myself, but then it has to really meet like the sniff test for me to actually recommend it to other people, right? And so yeah, now I feel like I know a lot more about when to recommend TTFD. So that's really insightful because I feel like I've got quite a few people with POTS and they haven't responded to benfotiamine. And okay, now I'm like, okay, this makes so much sense to me.
Yeah. And that's often the times the way that you'll be able to figure it out. And as you start using the different forms more frequently, you'll begin to intuit when someone's going to respond to a different form. It takes a while, but you'll get there because um oftentimes someone will try a form and they will discount the therapy because either they didn't use the high enough dose or they use the wrong form. And it's and this really speaks to the unique properties of each different form because it's not just giving the thiamine, it's actually something unique to that specific form, maybe where it gets or how it gets there or some other kind of unknown non-coenzyme effect it's having. But yeah. If someone tries a bemfo, they don't respond to bemfo, but they have this overall symptom profile that should ideally respond to something, then always I advise to always try at least three forms. Always try thiamine hydrochloride in a high enough dose, benfotiamine, and TTFD, and usually one of those should work. Occasionally, you'll have someone who's a complete non-responder and they won't respond to B1, but as a general rule, if they've got the symptoms, they should respond. It's just finding the right form, and that's where having a bit of extra information can help. I just want to say one thing: benfotiamine is the most studied in the West of the different derivatives. And it really is it's a remarkable compound, but it's very well known in the West. For some reason, a Western company just decided that they wanted to bring it into the US and actually start studying it. And so a lot of research has gone into that. What you find is that there's a fraction of the research published in English on the other forms. Maybe a little bit more on sulbutamine, but not very much on TTFD. Just if you go on PubMed, and so you would be you would be forgiven for thinking that this hasn't been studied, but you know, it actually I had to go to the Japanese and Chinese journals to find where all of the evidence was for this. So they'd been studying this since the 1960s in Japan, and most of the research was never translated into English. And so there's a lot of evidence for using these forms, but it just never filtered through into the Western kind of science. And it was Derek Lonsdale who originally had to import TTFD under FDA license in the 1970s. And that's the form that he found to be most effective for these autism and these POTS cases. Now, that's not to say it's not that one form is better than the other. They are just different. And that's really important to understand for your listeners, and especially if there's any practitioners. They are just different forms and they have their pros and cons.
I love that you study the PubMed journals. So I have a little practical tip. I speak Polish and Spanish and English, so I'm always looking at Polish, Spanish, and English and Russian. But how do you and I know how to translate those, pretty straightforward for me. How do you how do you translate the Japanese and the Chinese studies? Do you have any hacks for us?
Well, I know what the word thiamine looks like in Japanese now, but that's still about 5 years of reading Japanese papers to understand that. No, in answer to your question, I can't read Japanese and I can't speak Japanese. Neither can I read or speak Chinese. I've had to pay to have some of these things translated, usually via online translation services. Oftentimes automated. I do have a friend who's Japanese, who's helped me access some of the science. What you find is in Japan, a lot of this science is kind of kept. They're quite insular in many ways, and a lot of it is behind a paywall, but it's not that expensive. So, for instance, if you want to access a study, usually they'll publish the abstract in English. But the bulk of the study, what you either have to do is you have to copy and paste it and then change all the formatting and then put it into something like DeepL, get it double checked, multiple online translators. Or there are services these days where you can pay, a couple dollars to have the whole thing translated via AI. And that's been available for a couple of years. So those are the routes that I went down. And fortunately, you don't have to pay massive fees to buy these studies. Same as in China, which is wonderful. If the Western journals, for instance, you can pay upwards of $50, $100 just for one single article. Whereas, no, you pay approximately $5 to $10 per article, and of course it piles up, but it's totally worth it because you see that they've been using it to treat different conditions. They went crazy in the 1960s. There was like, wow, okay, this works for some people. We're going to give it to everyone. So they're giving massive doses for fatigue, fibro, what was then, it wasn't called fibromyalgia at the time, but they were treating all kinds of different conditions with TTFD, people with gut disorders. So this is well known in Japan. It's just no one knows it in the West, which is why I've tried to be like shouting from the rooftops and trying to educate people on this because I find it so fascinating.
I really, really appreciate it. I really appreciate you doing a deep dive on this and searching all of this out and translating it and making it accessible to all of us in the Western world. Because otherwise, I would have never known that. I would have never thought to search for Japanese journals or do that. So we really appreciate you breaking it down for us.
Yeah.
We were chatting about some of the cultural differences, and you're from the UK and you live in France. I'm from Poland and I live in the States, and we were talking about some of the culture shocks that perhaps you experienced when you came to the US for the first time. I would love for you to share that.
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, I grew up with American movies, so um, there's always been this kind of idealism, let's say, going to the US, what it would be like. Of course, I hail from the UK, so we come from grew up in a small village with windy roads and like tight knit population. Whereas first time in the US 2 months ago, I went to Florida. I was speaking at a conference, and the first thing that I noticed was everything is absolutely spread out, massive buildings, wide roads, massive cars. Everything is just so much larger and more spaced out and more spacious and less crowded. Felt really good to be there. However, the major shock for me was when I walked into a Walgreens. So Walgreens being like a pharmacy, common pharmacy, I guess. And my only experience of pharmacy is I currently live in France. They're quite conservative with regards to drugs, and the UK. And so I got into the Walgreens and I was amazed at how not only are there numerous aisles where the entire structure of the store seems as though it's geared up to have you buying more drugs. It's like it in the UK, this stuff, a lot of it is behind the counter, or it's just there, so you have to actually actively search for it. Whereas in the Walgreens, it seems as though there's big billboards of like, oh, if you have this symptom, come take these drugs. So you have this just massive aisles of tons of these different drugs that you can't even get hold of most of the time in Europe. But then on like in the same aisle, like they didn't even change the aisle. It's like at the end of the exact same aisle they're saying, "Oh, we want you to buy this drug to improve this health condition," and then you see tons of junk food on the same place. It's like they're selling donuts, pizzas, beers, and I tell you, the ice cream was insane. It must have been like 10 liters of ice cream in this one single bucket. I've never seen an ice cream jug as big as that, and it just I knew it in theory. I understood and I know the statistics of how unhealthy the US population is, but I never really comprehended how bad it was for people there, how little of a chance people had at maintaining their health because they go to the drugstore to like try and get something to potentially fix their health and they're bombarded not only with marketing to buy more drugs but then at the same time they're incentivized to eat foods junk which causes the very problems that they're going to try to fix. It just really spoke to me to how bad things have got in the US and that was the biggest shock for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I know I spent time in Poland and I lived in the Netherlands for a little bit close to a year and have traveled around Europe. And everybody, I feel like, unless you travel back and forth between the US and Europe, you just don't realize the vast differences. And I know a lot of times, we'll go to Europe and we'll be walking around the whole day and we have access to so much fresh food. When I'm driving around Poland, the gas station has like home cooked meals and they're incredible. Whereas in the States, you really have to work towards your health. I worked at Walgreens pharmacy from the time I was like 16 until I finished pharmacy school. I worked as like a pharmacy technician and then a pharmacy intern. And we used to sell cigarettes. Like people would like bring cigarettes from the front of the store and like get their asthma inhalers. I think a lot of the pharmacies don't do that anymore, but it's like it's really not that much better where yeah, they just offer so many different like things that do not make you healthy. And the other thing is like we have direct to consumer drug advertisements in the States.
Mhm.
Yeah, when I went to Europe, I was like, "What do you mean? Like, they're not advertising medications?" And they can actually advertise like butyrate and probiotics, where if you own a supplement company in the States, like you can't, there's a lot of things you just can't say. You can have thousands of research papers that talk about how supplement A does X, Y, and Z, but you can't really talk about it because it's like you can't make disease claims and you can't. I think there was some kind of a food try to say that it lowered cholesterol and like the FDA came after them. They're like, you can't say that the food does this, but it actually does do that. So it's just crazy like that.
Everything has to be, you have to preface every single thing with this statement has not been verified by the FDA. And if you make any claim, then the FDA is going to come after you. And yet, um, yeah, it's insane. I know exactly how hard it is to try and work your way around you know your product does something, but you can't say it, or you have to find a way to kind of bypass that. Well, because the FDA is so corrupt and they're not actually going after the ingredients that do and that are responsible for the illness. They're going after the ingredients which are trying to fix the illness. It's bizarre. It's an upside down world. It's clown world. It's insane. But yeah, that's just something you don't see in Europe. You don't see these big pharma adverts, and especially you don't see the disclaimer at the end of the advert, like, "Oh, this may cause blah 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 blah, heart attacks, intestinal distension, blah 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 blah." Right at the end of the advert, and yeah, it was really bizarre. I knew that was the case in the US, but and massive billboards as well. Billboards everywhere, like trying to get you to buy drugs, even when you're not in the pharmacy. It's so bizarre as someone who didn't grow up in that environment. It's really strange.
My 6-year-old watches YouTube, and the other day he was asking me what like a certain drug did because he heard a commercial for a certain drug. And I was like, "You are 6 years old. You do not need to know, about these medications." And it's like, he sees people with balloons having fun and at a party, and then they take this drug that's just like, oh my goodness. It's a jungle out here for sure.
How is that even legal? I mean, like during children's hours as well. I mean, that should be completely off limits. Yeah, that's bizarre.
Yeah, and that these advertisements are popping up for kids shows as well. Where can people learn a little bit more about your work?
Yeah. So uh, I have a website. It's called EO Nutrition. On there, it has link to my YouTube channel. It has some of the articles I've written. I have a website called thiaminprotocols.com. That is a paid document. Um, However, I also have a Facebook group which is called Addressing Thiamine Deficiency and the Paradoxical Reaction. The URL is Facebook/Thiamine Protocols. So we have 12,000 members. We have a lot of people asking questions about the different forms, when to use each different form, and things like that. So if people just want practical information, they can find me at any of those avenues. I am building a course right now, which is to take all of the work that I put into the PDF document, which is basically how to clinically apply thiamine, distill it into very simple kind of bite-sized videos and guides. It's going to have a more interactive approach, and that is really to try and condense a lot of the information, simplify it, and make it the most comprehensive and understandable for the average person. I'm also in the process of building a similar thing for practitioners, like I mentioned before. And that's going to go a lot more into the biochemistry, the mechanisms, and how you might assess a case to determine when to use what form, and the different blood work and lab tests and things that you can do surrounding that. So I'm doing a lot of things. And yeah, that's basically where you can find me. My supplement company that was born out of it's really based on designing thiamine protocols, and all of our products are really around that concept of high dose thiamine. So we have different thiamine derivatives and different cofactors and things like that. And you can find that that's simply objectivenutrients.com. And I'm also in the process of writing a book, although that's not going along very well. So we don't know when that's going to be available. What I would say, for those who really want to deep dive, a wonderful, excellent textbook on it is by Dr. Derek Lonsdale, Dr. Chandler Mars. It's called Thyroid Deficiency Disease, Dysautonomia, and High Calorie Malnutrition. It provides a really decent overview, but it is quite high level. So what I would personally like to do is take all the things that I've learned and condense them down in a simplified way where someone doesn't need to understand a lot of science to be able to take home some of the key points. So that's also what I'm working on at the moment. And the ultimate aim, Izabella, is to try and raise awareness of this wonderful therapy and change the thinking. Functional medicine, I would like it to be a go-to therapy, which is currently not. I'd like it to be something that practitioners know. Okay, if someone has these symptoms, we use thiamine and we use these different forms, because that's not where it is right now. And I think it needs to get there because it's untapped potential, like you said. It's not used as much as it could be.
I so agree with you, and I so appreciate the work that you're doing in this space. Hopefully, this interview will get more people aware. I'll do my part to raise awareness as well. And I'm so excited to have had this deep dive with you. Thank you. I could talk to you for like 3 more hours, but I know we should probably wrap up. Hopefully, this conversation has been healing on your healing journey.